Hello all, good evening and welcome. My name is Nate Rogers. I teach in the Historic Preservation Department here at Weitzman. And thank you for joining us here tonight, both in the room and on Zoom. For folks here, you may not know, but this is a hybrid event. And there's, I'm not sure how many people, Micah, but 20. So roughly equal. 20 people here virtually. That's right, there is food here, which is not available online. So thank you for joining for what I know will be an engaging and thoughtful conversation. Let me also express my gratitude to the Weitzman School of Design and the Department of Historic Preservation for hosting this event, and to Bill Whitaker and the Architectural Archives for sharing the Sainsbury highlights from the Venturi Scott Brown collection just before this event here. What an extraordinary resource. Preservation is rooted in the notion that architecture deserves our attention because it is capable of expressing meaningful things about itself and the era of its making. But I have to say, buildings don't always explain themselves fully on the first or even the 20th impression. And so it's the architectural archives and other repositories like it that give us unparalleled insights into aspects of artistic intent, design process, and architectural meaning. So let me tell you a little bit about the format for tonight. Many of you know this building well, paid close attention to, or even contributed in its making, and have been following closely all of the recent twists and turns. But the nuances of this story may not be as familiar to others. So as I am playing the role of moderator for tonight, I'm going to attempt something rather impossible, and that is to try and give a brief, neutral overview of the original design and the proposed alteration so that we have a common frame of reference. Following that overview, for which I have about 20 or so slides, I will then introduce the panelists, and I've asked them to each give opening remarks. Then we'll continue the conversation for a bit and conclude with an audience Q&A. And of course, we'd like to hear from all of you. We will prioritize questions in the room, but if we have time, we can open it up to the chat on the Zoom. So why are we here? Because the story of this building and its pending alteration matters, raising issues and questions that reach far beyond one corner of Trafalgar Square, or even an important design contribution from a Philadelphia home team. Broadly speaking, as a society, we accept and appreciate the value that new life for old buildings brings. But what about new life for newish buildings? I will suggest that we have been struggling for a while now, at least since the 1980s, to make sense of alteration when the building going under the knife is both important and young. And so the debates around these projects have generated plenty of heat, but not always a lot of light. And perhaps that shouldn't be surprising. Conversations around alteration are much more difficult and complicated. I would argue that by comparison, the question of whether to save a building from the wrecking ball is allowed to remain in the world of simple big ideas: preserve or demolish. Alteration is something altogether different, and it means we have to come to an agreement on all of the details that make the big picture. Exactly what is significant about the building to be altered, how those aspects can be retained and celebrated rather than marginalized, and how we deal with questions of authorship. In other words, different design languages and rhetorical content converging and colliding in the same physical space. The lack of really any meaningful temporal distance makes this essentially a post facto collaboration, or perhaps a coalition of the unwilling, if you will. In the 1980s, the architecture under threat of inappropriate alteration were the buildings of the 1960s and 70s. Think of Michael Graves' several proposals for the Whitney Museum, or Romaldo Gergola's proposal for Louis Kahn's Kimball Museum. More recently, I'm reminded of debates over changes to Charles Moore's Hood Museum at Dartmouth or Venturi Scott Brown's work, both at Franklin Court here in Philadelphia, or their Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego. And it's also significant that those two Venturi Scott Brown works, like Sainsbury, were themselves design responses to a pre-existing historic setting. These are complex, multi-layered sites where hard work is demanded of both contemporary designers and the public to make sense of a broad range of values. I'd like to suggest another factor at work to bring us to the current moment, and that is the perception that time seems to be accelerating. It's probably true that every generation has said that. But for cultural institutions, the cycle of renewal and transformation has been growing shorter and shorter. And I'm sure we'll get to the why for this later on. But this shortened cycle means that existing buildings are being scrutinized by institutional owners for their highest and best use. And I use that real estate term deliberately. During the same window in which these buildings are most vulnerable to the vagaries of ever-changing taste and fashion. These 1 to 3 decades after construction, whereas the saying goes, familiarity breeds contempt. And so even if we take these clients, who are often venerable stewards of culture, at their word that the need for alteration and adaptation is urgent, we, scholars, practitioners, and the public are under pressure to decide precisely what matters about these important buildings in light of the ostensible public interest, but without the benefit of necessary critical distance. Likewise, as design practitioners, and I am one of those, we are increasingly being asked by prospective clients to dive headlong into the legacies of architects who are still alive and well and often practicing. So Sainsbury and its latest developments has a lot to tell us, both in its project specifics and its larger themes. So with that, let's remind ourselves where we've come from, chronologically speaking. The National Gallery, going back a couple centuries, very briefly, was founded in 1824, but the building that we associate it with the gallery today was not completed until 1838. Designed by William Wilkins, the Wilkins Building, as it is called today, has itself undergone numerous campaigns of remodeling and expansion. Meanwhile, beginning as early as 1958, the National Gallery was looking at a site to its west for expansion. A competition was held in 1981, which I will touch on, but that plan was scuttled 3 years later. And Venturi Scott Brown, or Venturi Rausch Scott Brown, were selected out of a new competition in 1986, and the Sainsbury opened in 1991. More recently, Sainsbury was given grade 1 listing status in 2018, the very highest standard of significance in the UK. And a year later, it won the AIA 25-year award. Jumping to the present, the current renovation scheme for Sainsbury by Seldorf Architects of New York received planning approval from the city of Westminster just about a year ago, November of 22. Construction of the renovation has begun, targeting a 2025 completion date to coincide with the celebration of the National Gallery's bicentennial, which is being celebrated over 2 years, and that's termed NG 200. This is a site that is no stranger to controversy. And while I don't think we need to go too deeply into the prehistory, it's really impossible to talk about Sainsbury without addressing the cultural battle from which it emerged, a story that is now mythological to the architectural profession in Britain. Prince Charles, now King Charles, during a public speech in 1984, bluntly eviscerated a number of expansion plans and modern building projects that were then pending, including the National Gallery's plan, and specifically the high-tech design, which you see on the upper left, by Ahrens, Burton, and Korolek. He called it nothing more than a municipal fire station and a carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend, end quote. And given the public money on the line, it was no surprise that the gallery soon scrapped that plan and started over, holding a second competition in 1986. It was amidst a reactionary climate and some obvious bad feelings, and therefore inevitable that Venturi, Rausch, and Scott Brown received more than its fair share of criticism and polarization. And of course, controversy has attached itself to the latest alteration scheme. So let's get into some of the details. The stakes of the 1980s debate seemed so immense that it's worth noting the actual building site was at that time a car park. You can see that in the top right. And here in the proposed site plan from the architects, you can see the orientation of the Sainsbury Wing to the enormous frontage of the Wilkins building, with Trafalgar Square directly south. The photo at the bottom right shows Sainsbury under construction in the distance. And it's important to remember at that time that Pall Mall East was a busy thoroughfare. And also note how empty the square looks. If you went there today, it would look nothing like that. The square was dramatically redeveloped in 2003 by Foster and Partners with others, which has effectively changed the setting. And I think that's one of the topics for tonight. The changes included closing the North Road to traffic and breaking through the retaining wall with a broad set of on-center stairs, which you can see in the image, along with a pair of elevators to either side. And of course, the more immediate setting for Sainsbury was the Greek Revival context of the Wilkins building, a monumental yet quite quirky design that garnered quite a bit of criticism, both in its own time and in the intervening centuries. But we might say at this point, it's a visible part of the landscape. And here's the Sainsbury facade when it was completed. Hailed for its jazzy mannerism as it changes character, as one person said, like a Cheshire cat, stepping forward from the alignment of the Wilkins building to address the larger square. The pilasters, Corinthian column, and cornice detailing mediate between different notions of context, while the large openings are forthright in their contemporary publicness, intended to draw people in. You can see in the ground floor plan on the right, the careful thinking about entry and choreographing the flow of visitors. Once inside, accessing information, checking your coat, and going upstairs to the galleries, or via the rotunda to the Wilkins building, or downstairs to the auditorium or special exhibitions, you can find where you need to go. Large decorative columns, some of which are not actually structural. Is that right, John? Establish movement, orientation, and bound the space in rich and frankly ambiguous ways. So here are some images of the entry sequence. You can see the transition from outdoors to the scale of the interior, which is handled in a graduated way. In the center, you can see the partially double height loggia center with a portion of the restaurant on the, and I'll be speaking in European terms. So we're at the ground floor. The first floor is above us tonight, just to bear that in mind. So that's the restaurant in the center above you on the first floor. And the photo on the right gives you a sense of the interior lobby as you head to the stair. And I'll come back to the lobby again in relation to the proposed changes. Here's the grand stair, set between the curtain wall and the interior galleries, creating a hybrid indoor-outdoor quality. And the stair is a trapezoid in plan, creating a forced perspective that expands in width as you climb. The center photo is looking back down after your climb. Note the purely decorative cast iron, quote unquote, arches above you. And then, of course, there is the heart of the building, the 16 galleries for Renaissance art on the second floor, which matches the same level as the Wilkins building. And these were inspired by diverse influences, including Sir John College Picture Gallery. So let's talk about the current proposal. In the late 2010s, the National Gallery engaged Purcell, their master planner and heritage consultant, to help formulate the strategic goals for a transformative renovation to mark the 200th anniversary. And as part of this effort, there was extensive visitor and stakeholder engagement to understand what worked and what didn't work across the entire campus. So this informed the design brief for the 2021 design competition, and that brief is reflected through the current proposal there were really four goals. And I'll state them neutrally. Improve the visitor welcome and public realm, revitalize the education and research centers, improve circulation throughout the building, and improve the environmental performance of the envelope. In the interest of simplicity, what I'm going to show you is not the early scheme that was first released, but the revised scheme that received regulatory approval and is now under construction. So starting from the outside, I don't think anyone would disagree that the public realm in front of Sainsbury is limited, and that today creates issues with queuing and crowding. We can talk about that during the panel. But on the top right, you can see the proposed scheme, which peels away a section of the lawn in front of the Wilkins building to establish a new forecourt, what the architects are calling a square within a square. Sainsbury sits at the intersection of not one, but two axes. There's, of course, the east-west, which is recognizable, but there's also north-south, with Jubilee Walk connecting northward to Leicester Square. Something else that is important to this conversation is that the renovation will formalize the use of Sainsbury as the primary entrance for the entire National Gallery. For some time, Sainsbury has been the de facto primary entrance, although it was not designed as such. And because of Sainsbury's relationship to the ground plane, the architects and client advanced the view that Sainsbury, amongst every other part of the campus, is uniquely positioned to offer dignified and equitable visitor arrival. I will say, many questions have been raised and findings disputed about how adaptable the central Wilkins portico, which was the historic entrance and is on axis with Trafalgar and Nelson's Column, could be to addressing the demands of contemporary museum entry. And at lower right, you can see also a new door into the Wilkins building. That's a secondary entry to renovated research and member spaces. The other exterior changes are not so obvious. The curtain wall will be changed to be more transparent. According to the architects, black glass is no longer necessary to protect the artwork or reduce heat gain, but it is also a stated goal of the project to increase the visual transparency and create a more welcoming, dynamic environment within. These are their words. Subtle changes to gates are also part of the proposal, so that the gates can completely fold back, both to access Sainsbury and also Jubilee Walk. And you also note that the name National Gallery is being added at the top of the building, and that's to go along with the formalization of the entrance for identity and for wayfinding. Here's a concept section from the architects explaining how they've been thinking about the relationships between these two buildings and really how disparate parts and pieces can be connected into a legible arrangement and a circulation sequence. And I will point out they're actually excavating a new subgrade connection below Jubilee Walk, which creates a complete loop and offers them after-hours flexibility. And it's also important to point out that relative to modification in Sainsbury, what we're talking about is the ground and the first floors. There is no proposed change that I am aware of to the galleries on the second floor. That was a key consideration in the original design, of course, and the current National Gallery Director has called the galleries, quote, near perfect. So here, some plans so you can compare existing and proposed. So first, note the enclosure of the single-story section of the loggia at the bottom of the screen from left to right, and that's to create a new security vestibule for bag check. I think, as we all know, security requirements have changed dramatically over 30 years, and today security happens outdoors under the loggia in a more ad hoc way. It's also worth noting that the entrance was designed not to be the primary entrance, and at a time when the gallery had 3 million annual visitors. Pre-COVID, they were up to 6 million. The bookstore, which you can see occupies the entire western portion of the original plan, was determined not to be needed at the same size, so that's being removed to create a larger and more fluid entry zone. And note also how the columns and what the designers called the columns as walls have been changed and moved around the plan. They've been made smaller, but they are still oversized relative to their structural purpose. Some other subtle changes, for instance, the curved stone-clad wall with the Sainsbury name on it is being relocated northward closer to the elevators, and not visible here, but the Egyptian painted cast iron columns in the original bookshop are being salvaged and will frame the new smaller shop in the new plan. And you also note the replacement of flooring finishes indicated by the patterns on the right, and the different patterns relate to what's happening on the first floor above. So let's go there. Here, there are major replanning changes happening. This level today functions as sort of a lid over the ground floor. We could call it a mezzanine, but there's not much interconnection in the original design. The restaurant, which has already been closed, and the conference spaces are to be replaced with an open cafe and lounge, and a smaller bookstore is moved up to this level. The architect's stated goal, frankly, is to bring the two floors into much closer connection. You can note that two large areas of the slab are voided out to make double height openings to the left and right of the center. And there's a smaller third opening to the north by the stair. If you look to the west, there are new versions of the columns as walls, which are extended up to this level. And one of the things the architects have spoken about is their desire to bring daylight much, much deeper into the building on the east and the west sides. And so that's part of this relief in section. And that's because there's not the same light sensitivity that you'll find in a gallery environment. They also describe the need to juxtapose compressed space with tall space, since the removal of the bookstore makes the ground floor lobby a much larger area than the original. So we can talk about that in a bit. Let me take you back to the original lobby for just a moment, because this is where most of the really significant change is happening. And a lot has been written about this lobby and its deliberate sense of compression, the what has been called the anticipatory nature of its spatial qualities. We can unpack that, and how it was created to be fully separate from the spaces above it, with the grand stair providing the necessary sense of relief and drawing you upwards towards the art. And the grade 1 listing for the building specifically describes the lobby's undercroft-like volumetric qualities, alluding to ideas of a Renaissance church crypt. At the lower left, you can see a ceiling sketch from the original designers for the lobby, which reflect the volumetric aspects and the close relationship between walls, columns, and coffering. So as we wrap up here, I'm just going to share some three-dimensional existing conditions and proposed renderings. And where possible, I put existing photos with the proposed renderings to help clarify what's changing. So here you can see the proposed openings in the first floor slab above. The way that the Mannerist rusticated wall finish is extended upwards to the first floor, now that the two areas are no longer separated, as well as other changes to the ceiling and the flooring. Here on the left is another proposed view. Now we're all the way to the west in the former bookstore, looking back east toward the stair. And note the proposed use of rustication here as well on the double-story columns to make reference to the existing stairwell. And as we head up the stair and look back, changes are a little bit more subtle here. As I mentioned, the curtain wall will be fully replaced, matching the same divisions, but more transparent and more energy efficient. And the intermediate landing itself, which does not really change, did take you to the original restaurant, but now leads to the cafe and bookstore on that first floor. One subtle thing not so apparent in these images, if you look in the background, is the combining of two separate openings in the distance over the base of the stair, which is driven by other changes in the plan. One interesting aspect of this story is the way that the Seldorf design has evolved. And in the renovation architect's own words, they initially thought about design response in terms of a parallel language. But historic England, which was one of the key stakeholders, encouraged Seldorf to engage in a closer dialogue with the existing architectural vocabulary. So the architects talk about this in terms of unifying the approach between new and old to, in their mind, honor the original design and not visually compete with it by bringing in a new language. So the right image shows one of the elongated new column enclosures in the area of the former bookstore. And that column cladding will be the same Pietra Serena, which is the stone used in the original, a Florentine sandstone, very commonly used in the Renaissance. While the fascia, which has never been exposed before at the slab edge, is being given a cleft finish in the same stone to look effectively like it's been cut through, that you can read the action of it, so that there's ostensibly, and again, this is the architect's words, a dialogue on different ideas of rustication, literal rustication versus a mannerist rustication. And in closing this portion of the event, I thought something relevant to our conversation is that unlike so much architecture of the recent past, Sainsbury is designated, and it's grade 1. Only, just as a reminder to all, only 2.5% of all of the listed buildings in the UK are grade 1. And these come with very high standards to meet for proposed alterations. And so the text I've shared here is from the listing, which gives us some important clues as to how the significance of the building is viewed, at least in a regulatory way. So with that, I'm going to leave this image up for the remainder of the event, unless we have specific questions about plans during Q&A. And I'll ask the panelists to come up front, and we will dig in. Let's see if this is working. Testing. Yes. Okay. Okay. Let me introduce our fine panel tonight, beginning with David. All right. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. David Brownlee is a historian. Well, he needs no introduction, I'm sure, but for those online, David Brownlee is a historian of modern architecture and urbanism in Europe and America. Philadelphia has been a focus of his scholarship. His Philadelphia books include histories of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, the Penn campus, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Barnes Foundation, as well as studies of the architects Kahn, Venturi, and Scott Brown. Active in civic affairs, Brownlee served for 15 years on the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and he is now on the boards of the Preservation Alliance, the World Heritage City Project, the Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation, and the Design Advocacy Group. So welcome, David. Our next guest is John Chase, an architect with over 50 years of experience, including 15 years spent at the office of Venturi, Scott Brown and Associates. John was closely involved with all aspects of the design and construction of the Sainsbury Wing, from the competition throughout the entire design and construction phases. So John is our inside man. John studied painting at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, received bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied under Louis Kahn. He was most recently a principal and the director of architecture at Ewing Cole. Our third panelist, Pamela Hawkes, directed planning and design for a variety of museums during 26 years as principal with Ann Beha Architects in Boston, including renovation and expansion of the Currier Museum of Art, University of Maine Museum of Art, and the historic buildings at the Portland Museum of Art. Currently a founder of Scattergood Design in Portland, Maine, she developed a conservation plan for the Peabody Museum at Harvard with a faculty member, Michael Henry, and conservation management plan for the renowned J. Irwin and Xenia Miller House in Columbus, Indiana, with Penn Praxis. And Pam was professor of practice in historic preservation at Penn from 2016 to 2022, and a significant mentor of mine. And Bill, our fourth panelist, Bill Whitaker, is the curator and collections manager of the Architectural Archives of the University of Pennsylvania, Weitzman School of Design. Trained as an architect and architectural historian at the University of New Mexico and the University of Pennsylvania, Whitaker primarily works on documenting and interpreting Penn's design collections, including holdings related to the life and work of architect Louis Kahn and landscape architect Lawrence Halprin, as well as that of the husband and wife design team of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. So I'm thrilled to be joined here by these amazing panelists, and thank you for joining us. Let's get started. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to start us off by answering 4 difficult but important questions. Excuse me. The first is, how do we assess the historical significance of buildings created in our own time? I think that part of this is easy and relatively free of risk, but part of it is impossible. The easy part, which fortunately pertains to this case, is applying exactly the same standards that we employ in studying buildings of the more distant past. What amount of commentary, positive and negative, have they attracted? What patterns of influence can be associated with them? In the work of a specific architect or firm, or in a work that is part of a vernacular pattern, is the work exemplary of usual patterns, or, equally important, does it signal something new? Doing that evaluation is relatively easy, although, of course, it's not possible to know how these questions might be answered for the same building in the future. But I'm really not worried about what you might call false positives in making this kind of judgment. Buildings that are famous or notorious now, but may lose their luster later on. But I don't think that's a problem. For one thing, the fact that they were renowned at one time is itself historically interesting. The almost impossible thing is to avoid false negatives. And truly, that doesn't apply here. What can we do, though, about buildings that are unsung in their own time because they are built in places or by peoples whom we neglect, or because they reflect unremarked upon or unpopular ideas? It's impossible to be sure we get this right. All we can do is to look as widely and judge as ecumenically as possible. We can't overdo this because we really don't need to worry about having too much history. Second question, what is the responsibility of public institutions for the preservation of buildings? Our public institutions bear an enormous responsibility. They must sustain and broaden civilization, which is not an easy or cheap line of work. And most importantly, civilization is a project that has to be conducted in the dimensions of both time and space. The time of civilization includes now, but it is not an instant. And its space includes here, but it is not a point. And so our institutions bear an especially significant responsibility to preserving and employing in time and space our civilization defining and civilization enabling architecture. Third question, how do we identify the most significant features and hence parts most worth preserving of a building? I think that the most historically significant things about a building can be both those that exemplify known historical patterns and those that break them. In a sense, all of the work of VSBA breaks patterns while making new ones. And in the Sainsbury Wing, I see that 2 historically significant pattern-breaking patterns of their practice are at risk in the proposed and now, in fact, advancing renovations. Both of these have to do with the shaping of memorable space, which is, I think, something that we have not paid sufficient attention to in the work of Venturi Scott Brown. The first of these is the rich and intriguing doubleness of the facade. Venturi had experimented with screening outer facades in some of his early unbuilt designs. He wrote about the rich ambiguity of inside and outside and the place in between in complexity and contradiction. and it is a key feature of many of the most important works that he designed with Denise Scott Brown. The Sainsbury Wing has an outer skin that wraps like a theatrical curtain around the building, weaving its way from a thunderous crescendo of pilasters adjacent to the Wilkins building to an almost silent exit towards Pall Mall. The hem of this curtain is lifted at certain points to admit visitors to a loggia, an intriguing inside-outside space that civilizes the transit from Trafalgar Square to the museum lobby, where above it, the restaurant. The restaurant and the lobby are screened from the loggia by a second glass facade. This in-between space will be damaged, and I would say lost, but in this renovation. Another important spatial phenomenon that is at risk is the memorable succession of bright and dark, tall and low spaces that one experiences in entering, traversing the lobby and climbing the Great Stair. You've just heard about that from Nate. This conceit was immensely enriched, I think, by Venturi and Scott Brown's appreciation of the complex and often picturesque urban spaces of Europe. And it is to me astonishing that their enormous ability to create powerful spatial experiences like this one does not attract sufficient attention. I'm afraid it is simply easier to peg them as the makers of decorated facades. And that is a great peril for us in our ability to make use of and understand and make use of their work. The final question, what does respect for a historic building look like? Well, I think that respect for a building, like respect for a person, begins with really learning about what it's made of in terms of materials and ideas. One thing you might do is to talk to the architects who designed the building or visit the archives that record its process. After that communication, respect is a matter of assessing what the building or person can and cannot do in the time and the place where we find ourselves. In the case of the building that brings us together today, I think respect entails recognizing that the Sainsbury Wing can provide a soul-stirring introduction to Italian Renaissance art, but it cannot also serve as the sole entrance to a gigantic, multifarious museum. I turn it over to my colleague.
Well, can you hear me? My comments are going to be very brief because I think, frankly, David has addressed many of them. My connection to this project is emotional, and I'm not ashamed to say that because we were involved in it. It was occupied 5 to 6 years of my life. But I think that's not the thing that bothers me the most, is that I recall, and I mentioned this earlier around the walk around of the drawings downstairs, that at one point after the building was completed, I remember walking out to Trafalgar Square and looking back at the Sainsbury Wing with the now deceased Stephen Eisenhower, and we both were just amazed at how this ever happened. That in the context of a difficult client and government entity, that this very, very unique facade was ever created. And it's not like anything that's ever been done before or since. So my feeling about this is that there are certain buildings, and I'm not getting into the interior at this point, but there are certain buildings that are just such extraordinary works of art that they must be maintained, or at least maintained as much as possible. And I believe that the Sainsbury Wing is one of those buildings. And I think David mentioned this earlier, but I think Denise Scott Brown mentioned this or wrote extensively and eloquently about the movement into the building and up the stairs to the gallery, and how that and the modulation of light enhanced the paintings in ways that were profound. And so we should really think of that as part of this of the way that a building should be retained. Now, I'm not saying that this building couldn't have had some alterations to it. For instance, in the current scheme, they make use of what was the main bookstore and shop. And we all know that habits have changed with regard to books. People look at screens more often than they look at books. And the bookstore was enormous. And it's really almost as large as the lobby itself. And many of you have been following it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, for instance, is changing their, getting rid of their bookstore that's off the main lobby and replacing it with galleries. I believe that many of the components of what is currently called visitor enhancement could have been done through that without the destruction of the lobby. The lobby could have been maintained, and it still could have been, I mean, it was never, the Sainsbury Wing was never intended to be the main entrance. It was always intended to be a secondary entrance. And so in that respect, since in theory, it's been used as the main entrance for a while, or at least the gallery perceives it that way, that these enhancements by utilizing the bookstore could have been achieved without, like I said, without the destruction of the lobby. And that's my primary statement about this. And also, let's not forget about the fact that the Wilkins building is, this building, the Sainsbury Wing, is a tiny building relative to the Wilkins building. And there's no question that many of the enhancements that are being considered for the Sainsbury Wing could have been achieved in the Wilkins building. In fact, there were studies that showed that to be the case. And the Wilkins building portico, enhanced by the Foster Associates addition to the stairs it just says this is the entrance to the building. So why not make use of that? Why not enhance that instead of what amounts to considerable destruction of the Sainsbury Wing? I mean, I think when I think of this, I think, for instance, of Wright's Roby House. I mean, when it was acquired by the Chicago Theological Seminary, they wanted to tear it down and replace it with a dormitory for the school, and all hell broke loose. And eventually that was abandoned. And I go to myself, can I think of a world? Can I imagine a world without the Roby House? And I can't really. And I would say the same thing about Madison Square Garden. Does anyone look at Madison Square Garden and not feel the regret of the loss of Penn Station? So I'm sort of said all I'm going to say about this. It's really about how I feel personally about such an extraordinary work of art, which I was happy to be a part of, but was certainly not a primary component of it. But anyway.
Great. Well, good evening. It's such a pleasure to be back here at Penn. And is that better? Good. And to join such distinguished colleagues to consider topics that are so dear to my heart. But I'm also somewhat daunted by the task that we've been given. I have visited the Sainsbury Wing, but I certainly don't know it as intimately as John does. I really appreciated Nate's introduction because online it's actually a little bit difficult to understand what's being proposed for this project. And we don't have Annabelle Seldorf here to defend her design. As a designer and a colleague, that makes me quite uncomfortable. As a woman, I'd also prefer to be offering support to both her and Denise Scott Brown, knowing how infrequent it still is for women to be given commissions of such stature. and how easy it is, it seems, for others to find fault with our approach. Nonetheless, I'm very intrigued by the opportunity that the alteration of the Sainsbury Wing gives us to reflect more broadly on design, on permanence, on perspective, and on possibility. Museum buildings, as David has said, are part of any institution's collection, and rightfully so. They're inevitably expressions of their time, culture, and place. They're given pride of place in the community, built with quality materials, and often at great price. We expect that, like the collections that they serve, they will last beyond our lifetimes. But as we've already seen, and frankly, we're seeing everywhere around the world, that is no longer the case. And I think all of you probably have witnessed change in museums that you know. The museum that I know best is the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. It was the museum I grew up with. It's the museum that's now in my home. It began as a mansion built in 1801. In 1911, John Calvin Stevens, a distinguished architect, designed colonial revival galleries for it. In 1983, Harry Cobb of Pay Cup Free Partners was selected to design a significantly larger addition to it. And I was intrigued to discover that Harry Cobb was one of the competitors along with for the Sainsbury Wing too. I think of particular significance for me as a preservationist and a designer. Cobb considered this building not a signature building, but part of an ensemble that included the historic buildings around it, and one that I think led to a really extraordinary design. We made a tiny addition to the historic buildings when we restored them in 2005, but one that I suspect most people don't even notice. In the past year, the museum has invited 5 firms from around the world to transform the museum through alterations and an addition. The program was very similar to that of the National Gallery, providing greater welcome, providing more community space. And the winning concept, also, like the Sainsbury Wing, proposes some radical changes to both the ensemble and in particular, the Cobb building. Alteration, as referenced in our title and demonstrated in the proposals for the Sainsbury Wing, is a particularly challenging design typology, and not one that's given much attention, either in practice or in school. How is it different? I think we all talk about design in historic context as creating a dialogue between the present and the past. In designing the Sainsbury Wing, as Nate pointed out, Venturi Scott Brown had an open invitation in many ways to comment on the 19th century building by William Wilkins. Their stage was just a parking lot. Their design was positioned side by side with the existing landmark, a structure that is, through its mass and its repetitive form, could really hold its own against pretty much anything that Venturi Scott Brown could give to it. And certainly their bold and ironic commentary, I think, was appropriate for the setting. Seldorf Architects wasn't asked to restore the Sainsbury Wing, to recreate something that had been lost, and to make sure their fingerprints weren't visible. In fact, the English Heritage nomination for the Sainsbury Wing were marked on how intact the design had remained over the years, 30 years. The current design team was asked to join a dialogue that's been underway in Trafalgar Square for 30 years now. Heritage listing implies that their intervention should speak respectfully, perhaps softly, sort of tap the shoulder of these two buildings and be invited into the conversation. But the work must also make it clear, because of the program that's been requested of it, that new audiences are welcome, that the National Gallery is more relevant in the 21st century than when it was founded by white, male, upper class, and colonial establishment in the 19th century. Today, Harry Cobb's design poses similar challenges for the Portland Museum of Art. One enters through an elegantly proportioned and well-crafted brick facade, nearly solid and 4 stories high. Lieber Architects' winning design blasted a hole in Cobb's architecture and the austere facade. And I hope that as the design develops over the next year or so, the new addition that they're creating will establish a welcome that without the need for such a kind of obvious and perhaps radical change. So how can this kind of delicate but critical surgery succeed? We can't really develop guidelines for work in every context or transfer ideas from one project to the next, but we can suggest questions to be asked as part of the design process. First, what is important? And David's already addressed that to a certain extent. What are the values of the place? How does those, in particular, how do those values express themselves through the architecture? The heritage listing for the Sainsbury Wing describes key spaces and their components. Equally important, it identifies spaces that are not of special interest, that is available to be used as needed. It mentions the overall plan of the building, but not the kind of brilliant choreography and entrance which John has described, which we saw in the drawings, and which were such a key determinant of the form. That should have been identified as a character-defining element, but I think all too often landmark designations focus on surface appearance rather than the DNA and the design drivers the place, and that's a real gap. As David talked about respect, and I think asking the previous designer is critical if they're still alive. Interrogating the design documents is the next best thing if you happen to be lucky enough to have a resource like Penn's Architectural Archives and the incredible, the whole practice records that they offer for this project. In any setting, new or old, urban or rural, looking critically at context is essential to creating great design. Designers, I think, bring a heightened awareness of not just the particulars of program, but also of how a building does and should live and breathe. I like to imagine myself listening to that announcement that the flight attendants make before you take off every time about fastening your seatbelts and finding where the exit rows are, and then seeing some kind of accident nearby. And knowing that I would be listening to that announcement with much greater intensity. And that's the kind of intensity that I think any designer needs to bring, particularly in a setting of such incredible stature as this, because of course, the opportunities for disaster are very easy to slip into and very devastating in terms of their impact. I think this issue of how values have changed since design is a fascinating one, particularly for these buildings of the recent past. I had the pleasure, as Nate said, of working on the J. Irwin and Xenia Miller house. They raised a family in the house and they grew old in it. These brilliant house and gardens that Eero Saarinen, Alexander Gerard, and Dan Kiley had designed for them in Columbus, Indiana. When Randy Mason, Michael Henry, and I developed the conservation management plan for the site a few years ago, we recognized that the relatively modest scale and intimate connections between indoors and outdoors, between public and private spaces, were not just expressions of modernism, but really brilliant illustrations of the Millers' personal commitment to equal opportunity and equity across class, race, religion, and gender. these are values that I think resonate even more strongly today, ones that the Millers would have just accepted as, well, that's simply the way things are. I think it's of course interesting that the Sainsbury Wing has in fact gained significance also by time, because it is in fact the only commission that was done by Venturi Scott Brown, and because so many changes have been made to other buildings by the firm, that gives it also a special significance. How does a new design, we have to ask how the new design preserves, responds, and even enhances the character defining elements of the previous one? How does it resolve current challenges and address the values that have changed? I always pull out the Architectural Record article on Harry Kopp's addition to the Portland Museum, because it featured simple diagrams he created to demonstrate how its plan and massing respected the historic buildings. He also included images of the buildings that he considered from the local community as precedents. As designers, I think we have to embrace the public's interest in their surroundings and create opportunities for stakeholders to become allies by educating them about the design process, about what we consider important, and about the decisions that we've made. It's hard to understand, Nate. I think you did some magic with your presentation, because I understood their side-by-side comparisons, and your diagrams did a good job of, a better job of designing the design process. I hope that what I saw previously, the kind of ambiguity, was not necessarily intentional in terms of what was presented by the designers. We have to ask what assumptions or compromises have been made in the design process? What other options were considered? Change is inevitable, and frankly is an essential part of continuing use and preservation. When review agencies often first evaluate a proposal, they may assume it has had an adverse impact, as we say in the parlance. But by showing what alternatives have been considered earlier and rejected, whether for economic or aesthetic or functional reasons, a designer can demonstrate that there is what we call no feasible alternative, and actually win approval of changes that may at first glance seem too radical. I think as designers, we have to provide regulators with the reasons to say yes. And finally, why does all this matter? I have to say I'm inspired by the grand gestures that generated the Sainsbury Wing, as well as the Payson Wing in Portland. But I also know that museums are among the most energy-intensive buildings to operate these days, because of the need to maintain steady climate conditions 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. To paraphrase the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the most sustainable museum building is the one that's already built. And so the kinds of interventions that we're seeing at the Sainsbury Wing, I think, are inevitable and in fact appropriate if we really are going to meet our climate goals. But my hope is, of course, that we in looking at existing buildings, whether they are landmarks or just the everyday buildings, we can both embrace these extraordinary opportunities, bold moves, as well as more delicate and sensitive surgery.
That was great. So what a treat it is to be here tonight in the Fine Arts Library, and more especially that we are gathered in the studio space that was the home of Lou Kahn and his master's class. This is a great room to reflect on architectural heritage, its meaning and value to culture, and more generally, what makes a building or a landscape a thing of lasting value, deserving of a heightened level of stewardship. This building is also one of those places that we almost lost and was threatened with destruction or radical alteration more than once. In fact, it was one of those crossroads where an earlier generation of stewards were rising up and embracing approaches to design that recognize the essential value that community and connection play in continuity and connection play in community building and the development of cities. And so it was at a faculty meeting at the School of Fine Arts, probably in 1961, when a rising professor in the planning department stood up and advocated for seeing this building, the Fine Arts Library, then known as the Furnace Library, as an important example of architectural heritage worthy of reinvesting in. The building was less than 70 years old at the time, but was in the process of being vacated as Penn's main library. We got Van Pelt. Those remarks rallied other faculty members to the cause, including a rising professor of architecture who walked up after the meeting to introduce himself. And as Denise Scott Brown recalled to me, he said, "Hello, I'm Bob Venturi, and I would like to tell you that I agreed with everything you said." To which Denise replied, and this is a classic, "Well, why didn't you say anything?" So I don't mean to imply that Denise Scott Brown was the only person advocating for recognizing the heritage value of this building or the work of Frank Furness more generally, rather to recognize the efforts of individuals like her and Bob Venturi in making new connections to what comes before, to finding a way of working with that heritage through the medium of an alteration conceived of at the very highest level of art, fully intertwined with context, with heritage, with human experience and the realities of the everyday. So between 1995 and 1985 and 91, Venturi Scott Brown led a team that saw the full landmark restoration of this building. It is one of many projects in their oeuvre that shows their brilliance in making alterations and in working in inventive ways to reinforce and not lose sight of I can't read my handwriting, the heritage values of sites that they worked at. I'll leave it at that. So for me, one can feel or sense the weight of the creativity behind buildings like the Furnace Library, as well as the topic of this evening's discussion, the Sainsbury Wing of the National Gallery in London, in the voluminous records held in their archive, which you probably know are held in this building, and which some of you got a sampling of in the archives earlier tonight. As a curator and an archivist, I would like to raise a few points regarding the work that we do in the architectural archives and how that is shaped by and in response to contemporary approaches to heritage, and in light of our conversation tonight about the art of the alteration. First, I would simply like to reflect on the feeling of sadness that comes over me as a collections person at the loss that this project presents to us, knowing as I do how much went into creating a work of art at the level of the Sainsbury Wing. There are, as John reports, 10,000 drawings that went into the making of the building. There are dozens and dozens of project files. That weight I recognize because I had to move all that stuff. I had to put it in drawers. I had to count it. I had help, but still, it was a bit ridiculous. There are 5 boxes of white color samples that tell the depth to which they explored every aspect of this design. And with the depth of collections we have, including Kahn and others, you know that there are only so many opportunities as that you might have as an architect to work at that level. The Sainsbury Wing is one of them. Okay. Second, on the point of the role that an architectural archive can play in heritage conservation efforts, and especially with respect to the architecture of the recent past, when individuals responsible for evolving the design ideas into built form are still alive. I point to the importance that I've realized over time of collecting ephemeral histories from a variety of points of view, oral histories, in other words. The conversation in the archives early this evening was a version of that, just as this conversation we're having right here extends that into not just this room, but over the web. The archive's collecting mission has shifted and expanded with heritage conservation efforts in mind. And in my 30 years, and with colleagues like I have here at Penn, it becomes an inevitable thing. You know that there are things that people need to make good decisions about working with heritage, and that a collection like what we have at Penn can serve those and anticipate those needs into the future. So how has our collecting been reshaped or reshaped with specific, heritage in mind? Mother's House, Bob Venturi's great work of the 1960s. It was repainted recently. So I got with a colleague who's a paint conservator here, and we sampled all the different layers of green on that facade, anticipating a larger conversation that needs to happen, or a larger understanding about Bob's sense of color and the relationship of color, and how he worked with color, and how color was used in the work more broadly. Bob and Denise's home at 6904 Wissahickon Avenue is another amazing place where experimentation happens. It's also the art of alteration. They bought a house designed in 1908-09 that, in their eyes is a great example of Art Nouveau in America. And they painted the inside walls with these amazing stencils that got denser and richer and more complex and more colorful. And we have nothing in the archives to show of that process. So it shouldn't surprise you that I'm thinking about ways that we can capture that history and see it as something much larger. And I know that Denise Scott Brown, I know that Bob, I know Jim Venturi, all are concerned in the future about what's to come of that house, and that is very fragile. We've obviously collected things that then are responsive to the work that people concerned with heritage are. And I would just point to, since I've spoken about the Furnace Library, Mariana Thomas, was part of the team working on the restoration efforts, along with Bob Venturi, Denise Scott Brown in the office. So we have this depth of information related to that. And I would go on to Barbara Charles and the pogo panels at the Yale University Art Gallery that Lou Kahn did, and reconstructing those after they were ripped out, and bringing them back as a character-defining feature within a museum setting, collecting color photography of the Salk Institute so that you can understand change over time and the mechanisms of failure and change that were happening there, and give better perspective on that, to projects where you're creating an archive in the absence of one, where no archive survives, and you want to document something that has been overlooked. So a third point I'd like to make and conclude with, and I don't mean to be overly alarmist with this, but I can't help but fear that we are entering a period where the future integrity of works by Venturi Scott Brown will mirror what happened to the works of another great architect, Frank Furness, who I started with, an architect whose buildings were seen as difficult and eccentric structures. Sorry, I can't read my handwriting. Structures seen as old piles, redundants, all those kind of things that can be associated with something maybe not being seen as satisfactory today, that needed just to be cleaned up or tweaked a little bit, or, something that causes change. And sadly, these are all approaches that, in some way, shape, or form risk misunderstanding fundamental qualities. So as an archivist, I believe collections like we have at Penn are valuable tools in an understanding not just the past, but also in framing and thinking about the future. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, panelists. Lots of food for thought. I think what I'll do is ask probably one or two questions, and then in the interest of time, we'll open it up to the group. And this is not a question for anyone in particular, but one of the things that has been striking me, first of all, I ended up doing a very deep dive into the proposal, because I think, as you said, Pam, it's very hard to make sense of it online. Not the architect's fault necessarily, but the way it's been published in the media is long on rhetoric and short on information. And that's true no matter what camp folks are in. But I've thought a lot about the nature of museums in today's day and age. And I'm sure every generation, again, would say, these are unprecedented times. But what I'm curious about is the way we think of institutions today. some of which are centuries old, and their stated need to compete for people's attention in a crowded marketplace, to pull people off of Trafalgar Square and inside where they might look at some art or have a coffee or whatever the case may be. And so there's a mandate, somewhat self-imposed, maybe also externally imposed, for these institutions to rapidly adapt to contemporary ways of thinking about audience, inclusion, access, belongings, all of the things that we often call within the design profession visitor experience. And that is driving many of these project proposals. And what's interesting to me is we're not very often talking about galleries, which in a way is the kind of kernel in the heart of a museum, because that's where the art is. And it made me think of the helpful distinction between profound and profane space, frankly, and that the debate here is sort of about, pardon the term, but profane space, cafes, bookstores, circulation. And I think what folks may suggest is profane in their use, but profound in their design. I'm curious what Bob or Denise would say about the distinction of particularly from Las Vegas, between profane and profound, but also this building, which is arguably the very finest decorated shed. And I think Denise has spoken about this, but the need for buildings to incorporate adaptability because they can't anticipate future use. That it's a struggle to think that if what is in the design for the proposed alteration is not acceptable alteration, what would be? Or is there something deeper at work, which is the evident struggle, but maybe not the satisfying resolution of one designer in the legacy of another? So a couple of things to unpack there, but take your pick of any and all the above. How about adaptability? I think that, maybe John, we could say this building could be adapted in other ways that is not the current proposal, but I think we have to be honest. What would those be?
Well, I think what I've said before is that they make use of the space of the original bookstore,
which they ought to. It's part of the bill. Yeah.
It could have been. It just simply could have been in a different way. It didn't require the destruction of the main portion of the lobby. And I really think, in thinking about this, that effort is really leave that the direct since we're now saying this is the main entrance to the building, the entrance to an important museum in the 21st century requires a two-story space. Simple enough, because that, I think, is what was driven the destruction of the ceiling in the lobby, rather than a nuanced way of thinking about how you enter the building, because there is nothing that couldn't have been added by using that space that was available in another way. Simple as that. David, we had eaten many times at the original restaurant in this. It's a wonderful space, very complex and very interesting. But when when I asked the CEO, CFO of the National Gallery, he simply sort of tossed off my implication that such a wonderful post-COVID, it was not. We know that's the case. That management. So again,
Yeah.
emotionally going back to what is good and what could be perceived, what could be
And
Pamela or David?
when I just would say that I think one of the challenges here is to identify those things for which a building can be adopted and those things for which it cannot. And it's a really important thing to bear in mind that the Sainsbury Wing is probably only about 15% of the gallery space of the entire National Gallery, and it's at one end of the site. Great a place for an entrance, right? I think, and on the other hand, there do seem to have been some really substantial alterations to the circulation route in the Wilkins building since my time and familiarity with it. The creation of, I think it's called the Getty entrance at the ground level on one side, could be mirrored by one on the other side. And I agree that it's necessary to conceive of our institutions as moving things that have one foot in the past and one foot in the future, and a delicate part of the body suspended in the middle, where we are now. And that's a necessary fragile relationship between the past and the future that I think is essential. But buildings have the capacity to do that, or either a building has the capacity to do things, or that we have to have a different building. I mean, they're just things that are impossible under some circumstances. And I think we have to acknowledge the limits of human capacity. But again, this doesn't seem to be an insolvable problem to me. It seems to be not an architecturally insolvable problem. There may be ambitions for a two-story lobby that cannot be satisfied. But even within the Wilkins building, I think there are more possibilities there. Again, I know the National Gallery's 19th century buildings very well. Edward Middleton Barry doesn't get the credit that he deserves in this process, but he built a building that's the same size as the Wilkins building, which is the north side of the site. And he's the one who created the really great skylit galleries. But the long and the short of it is that all of these buildings have uses. The great E.M. Barry galleries are great galleries, but they don't have they also don't have the kinds of amenities we're talking about. And there's not a very good practical reason to put a major entrance on the north side of the building.
Well, I was just thinking that as a preservation architect, I guess I'm always aware that my work is in a context. That I am not the first person on the site, and I will probably not be the last. But I would venture to say that very few designers are trained that way. Right. And it's not to say that and when I looked at the drawings, and I could see every single detail was so carefully thought out, and they're very particular. It's very difficult to imagine how that building could be modified and remain true to itself. And I have to ask, is that a responsible solution these days, given what we know? We were in London a couple of weeks ago and spent a Friday morning at the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern. And that place was so full of kind There were parents with strollers and kids with toys all over the place. They were setting up for music and a big event, a kind of open house for probably younger folks in the evening. It's frankly what both, I think, the National Gallery and the Portland Museum of Art would like to be these days. Everyone, you could imagine, everyone was just coming in from the neighborhood. There was no sense of ticketing until you got up at the galleries. And it is, of course, a historic building that has been adapted for that use, a very rugged and robust historic building. And, I think these days we should be designing our buildings to be deconstructed, to be responsible.
Or what if some people
Called the loose fit.
That's certainly the 19th century and early 20th century galleries can do that. And on the one hand, it's exquisite to look at a Swiss watch that is the Sainsbury Wing, but I also And it is exquisite to be, it is only a museum or a private home, to be able to have the public experience a building like that is extraordinary. And we shouldn't lose that opportunity. But we also, that may be the 20th century, and maybe the 21st century has a different kind of song to sing.
Yeah, point well taken. I know it's just about 20 minutes after the hour, so I want to take questions from the audience. If folks, yeah. But yeah.
And when we there are essentially that I teach about European architects coming to the Americas and building important buildings.
And we
that we have architects from the Americas in anything of any important here. And all here that I get here, I think this is one of the most important. I think this is one of the most important buildings designed by American architects or African architects. So my pitch for the preservation of this building is that we should look at this building
the same way.
And think about intervention the same way
We would
I don't think this is working.
now.
This is the market presence. The very culture practically that's sometimes difficult choices actually bring something new to this. And now the debate actually are much better. Why do not put too much? I think that part, we all, it's difficult. Different ways.
That's maybe.
Oh,
Okay. Well, I'm more or less done.
batteries.
This comes in and out. Thanks for your comment. I appreciate that. Editorialize for a second. I will say I did something pretty unfair tonight, which is to compare photographs to rendering. We're dealing with the nature of architecture as a projection into the future until it's built. And if we look back into 1987, 1988, the most terrible things were said about, the most terrible things were said about the Sainsbury Wing. And then it was completed in 91 and things calmed down quite a bit. So of course, the problem in this case is that at that time, construction is complete. So we don't have input, but Pamela.
Well, no, I mean, that is such a classic case that no one likes change.
Right.
And so we protest and protest and protest, and then it's built. And then 25 years later, we're protesting that that what we hated to begin with is being changed.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, that's why you see this like,
Well, except that the hate that was spewed on this building was really not about the architecture. It was about the choice of an American architect to do such a significant building. And
Well, but the critiques were,
there
some of them
were, but
architectural.
they were
Yeah.
not as profound, let's say.
Yeah.
I have I want to spin off of what
I will
you're
just say, I'm sorry to interrupt. I will say several critics called the lobby shockingly low. So, you know, now the
Did
argument,
anyone look at the photographs of that and think it was shockingly low? I don't know. I wouldn't say that.
unexpectedly low. I don't know if you were thinking. I just wanted to say that one recollection when Bob and Denise were working on this building was one of the things that was very striking was that they were immensely interested in Frank Furness.
Mhm.
They wanted, I mean, and they were enthusiastic discoverers of the past. And that ties to the other thing I wanted to say is that we don't necessarily have to think of the past as something that's old. The past is something where we find new things every day. It's just part of, you know, it is a piece of our environment. It's an element that we have the right to make use of. There's a responsibility too, but there's also an exciting opportunity to find inspiration for things that are different from now in the past, that are perhaps better suited for the future than where we are today.
One of my little ephemeral histories that I like to have collected was standing in the archives when I was maybe still a student, watching the Vagelos slabs being built. And they tore down a piece of heritage for that, but watching the building being built. And then one day seeing, and I don't think I had really met Bob and Denise at that point, but seeing Bob and Denise standing across the road, looking like American Gothic, and one of their poor interns holding up pieces of terracotta like this against the furnace building for an hour, right? And what they were doing is choosing the materials of that building with this building in mind years after they had renovated it. And just seems like that's a poignant memory of how they kept their attention on the building that mattered, or on this, you know, or recognize that this was a building that mattered and that they needed to yield, or they needed to shape their thinking relative to it. And so the red of that building is not as red as this building. And so when you look at those two buildings, recognize that they made those choices with this building in mind.
Other questions? Comments? Wendy?
I love this idea of adaptation because it feels two-sided. It's about the architect adapting to the existing, but it's also sort of demands of people coming to this building adapting to something that's not familiar to them. And I feel sort of a recurring theme through what all of you have talked about, and thank you, this has been a great panel, is this sort of expectation of architecture to be very service-oriented, to be very open, to really bend.
Sorry, we can hear you.
Oh, it just came back.
And I think especially in sort of the context of an art institute where someone should be going with an open mind and adapting to what they come to. And so I think I'm just sort of reflecting on this idea, and I really like that framing. Sort of, it's a very different one. Or adaptive reuse. Like I love that it's about a conversation that we have with architecture. And if any of you sort of have an idea of another project in mind was framed that way from the get-go in its sort of design process, and there was a very active discussion about, yes, this is maybe not what people expect today, a 2-story lobby to a gallery, but how can we, how can we make it okay? How can we make them comfortable adapting themselves to something, because I think it's often about comfort, and I totally appreciate that, wanting to be open. So how do we invite people to adapt themselves to this.
Or invite them to accept the possibility of new experiences, of
Mhm.
something different than they expected as being exciting, and not something that puts you off.
I think it's a good point. Again, if I can, I'm not sure if the moderator is allowed to editorialize,
No,
but
you're not.
some of the implicit rhetoric through the visitor engagement and the master planning that was done leading up to the design competition was, we asked the people what they want, right? And I think that's the thread that flows through here, and it's something that I think is challenging for us to confront, because there's a populist aspect to that notion, one that should not be dismissed, but we're also therefore then talking about architecture design in a certain way to challenge and provoke. And I think that's where I also step out here to talk not just about this building, but also postmodernism in general, which is, how do you alter a building that has so much rhetorical content? I think we're all very comfortable with the notion of altering buildings 100 years old, 200 years old. The focus then tends to be on physical fabric, maybe some idea of, well, you know, the architect had a Beaux-Arts idea of planning and symmetry, and we'll pursue that. But here we have a very idiosyncratic piece of architecture that's a real challenge. So David, I cut you off.
No, but let me just say quickly, to pick up one thing of what you said, and I'll let us pick on other pieces, is just that the idea of asking people what they want and then providing it is a good model for water supply and electricity. But I don't think it's a good way to create art. And as a historian and not as a designer, I'm going to say that I don't bear any responsibility for creating new ideas.
Yeah, lucky
I
you.
study what you guys do, but I count on you to do interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to, in some really essential ways, be an act of leadership and of visioning a future and beginning to build it. Not just saying, and what, you know, how many gallons per minute would you like? Yeah, that's right.
And people are plumbing, maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know about any other thoughts on that. I think we're about 5 minutes, or we're right on the hour and a half. Other, maybe one final question or comment?
Is there anything from the chat?
But they're quite long. I will read the first question.
Well,
that is
then
less
let's
long. I apologize, Richard. The first question is from Carolyn J. Adams. The question is, was consideration ever given to keeping the Sainsbury Wing as an important item in the collection of the museum, with necessary changes to the museum at large to be accommodated in the Wilkinson?
Yes, the answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
And it was done, I circulated that proposal.
Yeah, there was a Dixon Jones proposal from 2005,
Right.
I believe.
Right.
And I believe Purcell looked at it again in the late teens.
don't.
It's been a recurring conversation.
Right.
And Pamela, you brought up a great point. You know, no one from Seldorf Architects is here to defend their project. If people are curious, if you go to the AIA UK website, you can actually watch Annabelle Seldorf's keynote address to RIBA and the AIA UK, which took place in November of 2022. And she talks about this project for 40 minutes. And she takes a question from, I think it's John Dixon of that firm, exactly about this issue. So it's not an issue that will die, I'm sure.
No.
But I don't feel qualified to answer it. Frankly, the decision has been made, you know, that the Sainsbury will be the entrance.
But I've just been thinking now about, and in answer to your, not directly answering to your question or your comment, but we've been talking so much about just the entrance. Haven't talked about the galleries at all as that's the reason why this building is there,
right,
for that. And as far as we can tell, the response is nothing but positive, or essentially nothing but positive.
They're near perfect.
Near perfect.
Says the director.
But that comes from the administration, not
Right.
but I think generally that's the way it's been felt. And it really is where this particular collection connects to the Wilkins building, that they're all there on the same level.
Right.
And that's probably really more important in the end to your experience of a building than the height of the lobby, for instance. So,
And there is change coming to the grand stair, but by and large, it's very minor.
yeah, it's very minor. Right.
And we haven't talked much about the stair, but the stair is a key component in the building. And I mean, it's one of those aspects of the space that literally prepares you for the art. And I think it's going to be so fantastic, that it's being saved. I think with that, I think we will close this panel. We want to thank you all for joining. Thank you for coming this evening, both here physically and online. Thank you to the department and the school for hosting, for our panelists for giving their time and giving us a lot to contemplate. And I just want to close with a couple of quick thoughts. I would like to advance the view that what we're talking about here is a project type all its own. And it's one that is full of latent possibilities. I think as we've discussed, those possibilities are hard to grasp. They are contested, ambiguous very often, but the possibilities are there. And that if we, as professionals and the public, cannot find really the best ways to reimagine the vast inheritance of what has already been built by seeking the most, whatever it is, optimized, beneficial, considered and thoughtful combination of adding, editing, altering, modifying, informed by the best advice, then the future is not bright. Demolishing and building new is always easy. I think we all know that. Modification and alteration are far more difficult to do right. But when done right, it is deeply rewarding. And as you pointed out, relative to the climate change or the environmental crisis, it is not only rewarding, but it is necessary. So with that, thank you, panelists, and thank you all for coming.